This is Tatooine.
Hey everyone, welcome to Reed Makes. In this video, I'm going to be making a Star Wars diorama set on Tatooine. I started out with a picture frame and then added some foam core in various layers to keep the bottom open for some electronics later on. Once the base was ready, I moved on to cutting some 1-inch thick XPS foam to create the base layers for the buildings. I then went to cut out some arches, and I found this little guy hanging around, and it was the perfect diameter to create the arches for the sides of the buildings. Once I had the bulk of the foam pieces cut out, I began gluing them together and assembling them piece by piece, and then putting them onto the base. I then cut out some small 1-inch pieces of foam core, along with a couple 1-inch cubes for the landing. I glued on the last larger arch, and then moved on to working on the domes. I wanted one of the buildings to have more of a tower-like structure. To do this, I started by cutting out really thin strips of XPS foam. I then cut them down a little bit smaller, added a small platform, and I traced this foam circle for the size of the tower. And then around the ring, I indented various points where these pillars would stand. I felt like the space in the middle was a bit blank, so I added this piece of foam as a backdrop. I added a few pieces of foam on this side to raise this building, and then I cut out some small wedges for some detail. I added a sewer drain underneath the stairs, and then I added 3 arches here, which I ended up changing later on. I felt like the sides of the building still looked a little bit bland, so I added some pillars and other vertical accent pieces around. Once I had finished all these smaller details, I went to cutting a piece of cardstock and then gluing it around the pillars where the tower was to create a nice flat surface. Once that was done, I made a texture paste with plaster, paint, Mod Podge, and a bit of water to thin it down. I think I made the paste a little bit too runny, but it still got the job done. Once I finished covering all the surfaces, I then used the paintbrush to kind of stipple and leave a rougher texture. I then cleaned up my workspace and began to work on some of the details like the doors. For the first door, I used a piece of cardstock and beveled the edges and then traced on a design. I cut out pieces with holes as a second layer and then glued them on for some more depth. I wanted to add some more detail to the top of the building, so I made this communication antenna and added some other bits and pieces to make various crates. I then made some pipes out of some armature wire. I used toothpicks for the sewer grate, and I cut pieces of these straws for some more piping. For the other 2 doors, I used these pieces of plastic canvas, and I traced to the arches with this tea light. Once I finished adding all these details, I mixed up some watered down PVA glue and spread it around for the sand. I knocked off any loose sand and then sprayed isopropyl alcohol to lock it in. Once that was dry, I began painting and I started with a light tan. Once I had the base coat done, I then went to the buildings and added various stains and washes. For the paints of all this terrain, I used just regular craft paint. I started with a lighter brown and then worked my way up to a darker brown. I painted the sewer grate black for some visual depth, and painted the antenna and barrels with black and gray. I wanted to add the red awnings we see on so many of the buildings on Tatooine. So I stuck in some toothpicks for the rods, and I painted them black. I painted the doors with various browns and oranges to give a rusted look. I then dyed some tissue paper with red paint, and draped them along the rods. After I finished painting the buildings, I then went back to the sand and added various washes. I kept most of the darker colors towards the edges and the corners of the buildings. I printed out some miniatures from my 3D printer. I printed out Star Killer, Aayla Secura, a Stormtrooper, and this Rebel. For the lighting, I am using these 3-volt LEDs that run off of this coin battery. I got this idea from Boy Lie Hobby Time. I wanted to hide all of the wiring, so I glued the light onto his hand and drilled a hole and ran the wiring through his body. I cut off the existing lightsaber and then replaced it with a 3-volt LED filament. I drilled a hole through the lightsaber, and then I ran the wiring down his arm and back. I then did the same thing for Aayla Secura's lightsaber. For the lightning effect, I'm using fiber optic wire. I bent it in a zigzag shape and sharpened the end. I found the individual pieces to be difficult to glue together, so I stuck them down in some clay and then used some tacky glue to stick them together. While that was drying, I then started painting the miniatures. I painted them black first, and then I went over them with a dry brush. For the dry brushing, I started out with a gray and then worked my way up to a white. For my paints, I am using Army Painter's starter set along with their speed paints. After finishing painting Star Killer, I glued on the lightning and gave it a test. And then I painted Aayla Secura, but with her I started with just a gray and then a white, and then moved on to the colors. Though I know she dies in Revenge of the Sith, I liked her pose and she was a free miniature on Thingiverse. I then moved on to the Rebel Soldier, again starting with black and doing a dry brush. Lastly, I painted a Stormtrooper. I used a gray and then dry brushed white. I always find it hard to paint white, I don't know why, maybe it's my paints. Either way, I think the Stormtrooper turned out pretty good. After painting the Stormtrooper's pauldron, I then glued him down onto the diorama, along with the Rebel Soldier. I drilled a hole with a pin vise for both Aayla and Star Killer's lightsabers, and I ran some wires for the blaster bolts. I cut a hole in the side of the diorama for the switch, and after it was cut, I glued it in. I painted the exposed edges of the diorama with a matte black, and then added some final touches. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.